Hey, good morning and welcome to PrepperCon Radio. As always, wow, mic is way too high. As always, this is Scott Stallings. We've got Shane Coles in house.
Good
How
morning,
you doing, buddy?
I am very good. Very excited to talk to our guest today.
Me too. We've got a very special guest waiting on the line. Holy crap.
Yeah, I've been following this guy for at least 2-3 years now on YouTube, on his websites, and we'll get into that. He was out to PrepperCon year before last.
Came out a year ago, and he brings quite the following wherever he goes. He is truly an expert. Ladies and gentlemen, we have Ben Davidson.
Ben Davidson of Suspicious Observers.
He'll be on in just a second. Before we jump in to our topic today, which will blow your mind, we're going to be talking about coronal mass ejections, what's going on with the gravitational field in the United States, across the world, the entire world, everything. But what does that do for us, and how does that affect us?
And how and why we need to prepare for it, and why we need to be aware of what Ben is, what he talks about, and what he's created a disaster prediction app that we'll talk about.
That's right.
He's working on it. It's in the process right now.
And all of this today is brought to you by our good friends over at Survival Medical, survival-medical.com. These guys have solved the expiration problem on your survival gear for your first aid. First aid's always been one of those things that you're always replacing it, constantly replacing it, whether you use it or not. Now you're only replacing it when you use it. It has a 20-year shelf life. You can just put it with your food storage and forget about it till you need it. Get a bunch of them. They've got great prices. They're also going to be in Sam's Club coming up soon. So check them out, survival-medical.com. They've been so kind to sponsor the show, and that's what I carry in my car. That's what I carry at home.
And I am gravitating and everything. I'm switching everything over to their kits, their supplies.
Yeah, great program. All right, so before we go on any further, I just want you to know, do not freak out.
Very good point.
We're going to talk about some heavy stuff. Do not freak out. This isn't, hey, we're talking about gardening. We're talking about, this isn't, hey, this is day-to-day preparedness. This is, holy crap, this is what's going on.
Potential doomsday stuff. And that's not what we really typically like to talk about. But this really is more about awareness of really what we're seeing every day in the weather. And let's get definitely right into it.
Let's bring Ben on. Ben, are you there?
Yes, I am here.
Awesome. Hey, thank you so much for being here with us on PrepperCon Radio for the first time. We hope to have you on in the future multiple times here, and we are so grateful that you took time out of your schedule. I know you're super busy.
Oh, absolutely. It's a pleasure. I had fun when I came out to PrepperCon 2 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. It was fantastic to meet you there. You and I had a few short discussions and kind of got to know each other a little bit, and I just think you're a fantastic person, and I love what you're doing, and you really opened my eyes, and I know a lot of our listeners follow you on a regular basis, follow your daily missive, whatever you want to call it, your predictions, your weather report, your space weather report, and we'll get into that. And so I know everybody, feel free to call in with any questions. We'll try and take questions in the next segment, but what I want to, there's so much I want to get in with you. I don't hardly know where to start here. You have suspiciousobservers.org. Tell us about your other sites you have and your YouTube channel and so forth.
Well, the good news is if you find one of our sites or our channel, everything else is easy to find because every single one of them is a portal to all of the other ones, so they all sort of link to each other. In 2011, while I was unhappily working as a investment company's due diligence expert, which is a fancy way of saying their research rat, basically making rich people richer, I decided it'd be fun to do research on things that interested me, but using the same types of skills and predictive analyses that I was using and that I have been taught to use in law school and then in my job in the investing world. And it turns out that is a wholly new thing for most of academia. That is a new way of doing these research efforts, and people really seem to respond to it. Here we are 5 years later. We are just under 275,000 viewers. About 30 to 50,000 of them are actively engaged every single day. To the point where we're really able to disseminate a lot of this good information to a large number of people in a quick fashion. And then they go and they're able to share that, whether it be on social media or on their own YouTube channels, things like that.
And you're really challenging the norm as well in the scientific community. And we'll get into that a little bit later, but let's talk about space weather and what is space weather. And I know you have your update every single morning. It's you're crazy early, like 3 a.m., putting your little YouTube video together. And why don't you tell us a little bit about what you do every morning and what space weather is and why our listeners should be watching your updates every morning and being aware of how space weather affects the Earth.
Well, absolutely. First off, you can either find the Suspicious Observers YouTube channel, go to suspiciousobservers.org, spaceweathernews.com, or in this case, for those listening to this show, I recommend watching daily at earthchanges.org. Earthchanges.org, because that's really the site that pulls all the other stuff together and is sort of meant to be the, hey, I'm interested in this stuff, I want to know what's going on, but I'm not a physicist, I'm not a mathematician. Explain it to me in a way I can understand.
And absolutely, and I'm glad you brought that up. Sorry to interrupt. It does take a little bit to watch your videos and to kind of educate yourself a little bit on the speak, on the different terminology and so forth, to really understand your broadcasts every morning. And so it takes a little bit of education, but it is fantastic, and I go down the rabbit hole very deep, and it is, I geek out on it. I guess that's the simplest way to say it.
Well, that's very cool to hear. I definitely geek out on it myself. So what space weather is? Space weather is the way in which the Earth interacts with space outside of it. Now, this includes things like asteroids and a supernova, if one ever unfortunately were to go off in our galaxy with us here to watch it. But for the most part, this has to do with how the Earth and Sun are interacting. This would be, if you've ever heard of things like solar flares or solar storms and how they can affect Earth, things like that, that's really what we're talking about. And in the past couple of years, scientists are really discovering that, hey, maybe the sun plays a bigger role in things like the weather and climate change than people think. Some of our own research and other researchers across the world are suggesting that the sun plays a role in earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. And there's a ton of evidence out describing how even our bodies can be affected. I mean, things like heart attack risk, stroke risk, migraine, seizures, suicide risk, infant mortality, pregnancy rate. On a larger scale, things like times of peace versus times that are more likely to bring about a revolution. All of these things can be tracked through space weather. And so these things are important on a personal, a geopolitical, and on a natural disaster scale, which is why so many people, once they sort of wrap their heads around what it is we're talking about, are like, hey, I get an update on all of this stuff globally, what it means in terms of earthquakes, weather, my own health in 5 minutes every day. That's why people are so interested in the daily update.
Yeah, absolutely. And the daily update, I watch it almost every single morning. I know a lot of our listeners do too. And when you came to our first PrepperCon, I was talking with much of the crowd who was listening to you and said, oh yeah, I listen to his updates every single morning, and they really are very informative. And let's talk a little bit more about why we need to look more closely at the sun. I know you mentioned it can affect our health, it can affect our weather. Let's get a little more specific on that, and why your updates every morning are so important to watch.
Well, absolutely. In as simple a way as I can possibly put it, as much as our community likes to recognize and call out and make known when data doesn't look right or when we think there's a conspiracy or something's being lied about, and we absolutely should be doing those things, because it's not like anyone's ever going to come out and tell you, hey, the world's going to end tomorrow. Prepare. It's on us to have our eyes open.
Amen.
At the same time, there is a ton of stuff out there that is actually out there in public. It's just not tied together. There's not lines connecting the dots, and it's not really discussed in a helpful way. And the most important of those examples would be how Earth's magnetic protective field is weakening. Earth has a magnetic field that wraps around the entire planet. It's called the magnetosphere. I like to refer to it as just the magnetic field or Earth's magnetic shield, because that's actually what it is. It protects the Earth from dangerous radiation from the sun and from the rest of the galaxy. In fact, these correlations that we're noticing with weather, with earthquakes, with human health, in fact, the only thing standing in between the sun having complete control over these things in our lives is that magnetic barrier. It is a protective interface, a shield from energy from space. And what is not being made secret by any stretch of the imagination is that it is weakening very, very quickly. And this is happening as the magnetic poles are moving as well. Many people have heard that we're in the process of a magnetic pole flip, and that's absolutely the truth. It's somewhat of a complex topic, but doesn't change the fact that it's very real. Now, it's not a geographic thing where the North Pole and South Pole are going to flip over and the entire Earth is going to stop spinning the way it's supposed to spin, but the magnetism changes, and as the magnetic poles set to reverse, our magnetic field weakens, and that leaves us open.
Yeah, and absolutely. And let me just jump in for a second. I guess on your earthchanges.org website, there are a number of free videos that everybody can go and watch these and get themselves educated. Exactly what you're talking about. And like I mentioned, I geek out on this, and it's very informative, and it absolutely holds my attention. I wanted to talk a little bit more about this magnetic field since you've gotten into this. I guess right now our sun is kind of in a quiet period. It's in what you call the Maunder minimum, correct? Is that?
Yeah, it's going to be approaching that level over the coming few decades.
Okay, so we're still not there.
No, but we are coming down off of a shorter cycle. So there are those really long-term cycles of high activity and low activity over about 400 years. But within that, there's a smaller oscillation up and down in activity over about 11 years. Over the past 4 or 5 years, we've been high in activity, and we're going down towards the minimum now. There's a question about whether or not we're actually going to see another maximum period, another 5 or 6 years from now, or whether or not we're going to enter that longer, larger, more significant minimum period. But in general, the sun is acting very, very weak. And that is sort of a double-edged sword. It's good on one hand because our protection from the sun is disappearing, so we don't want the sun to be throwing anything major at us, although it's not exactly weakening fast enough to offset how fast our shield is weakening, and it's not even capable of weakening fast enough to offset how much our shield is weakening. But there's a double-edged sword there that we won't go into a ton because this is a bit more complex, but in essence, it's going to cause the kind of climate changes that our genius ancestors described. The same ones who laid out the foundations for our geology and our geometry, our archaeology, our architecture, even our philosophy. Those same people who talk about things they saw in the weather and the earthquakes in the sky, things that they could only describe as the gods coming and being angry with them. That's the kind of climate change that we haven't seen in the modern era, but that's the kind of climate change that happens about every 400 years or so when the sun decides to go to sleep. But that's another story. The real important issue, because we can deal with climate change here and there, the real important issue is the fact that regardless of the fact that the sun is weakening, and even if it goes all the way down really, really quickly, it can't go down far enough that Earth's weakening magnetic field will be a non-issue, that it will be all okay. What this is really doing is this is allowing solar energy in the form of electric currents, charged particles, plasma, across a number of different vectors. So
Ben, we got to cut you off. We're going into a hard commercial break. We'll be right back with Ben Davidson, Suspicious Observers. Tune in. We've got some callers on the line that'll be with us when we get back. All right, welcome back to PrepperCon Radio. We've got our good buddy Ben Davidson from Suspicious Observers. We had a caller on the line that had a question. He probably had to hang up and go back to work. But if he's still listening, Paul, I remember your question. His question was, why does the sun appear white where it used to be more of an orange color? Do you know why that's changing?
Well, I've heard that claim a number of times. I haven't been able to get any kind of data globally or anything else like that. The sun has looked different for me, whether, depending on whether I'm in Pittsburgh or I'm in Albuquerque or Phoenix or wherever I am. And not only is the geographic location going to be changing, but the atmospheric chemistry is changing as well. Even the shape of the atmosphere is changing as the sun weakens and as we lose our protection from the sun. These things are all changing. Everything from maybe even the motion of things throughout the sky eventually, if it starts to affect the lensing effect, to the color and amount of heat that comes through. I can't necessarily speak to the color, but I can say that if anybody has noticed that it takes you a lot less time to burn than it used to take you to tan in the sun, that's probably because we don't have as much of a protection from it. In fact, we're down probably somewhere between 20 to 25% in our magnetic field right now, and that would be the more conservative estimate. If you do some scary math, it could be upwards of 35 to 40% of our shield has disappeared just in the last 200 years or so.
Well, that's
and that's actually an
scary.
Interesting point, if I can mention just how fast our field is weakening.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, please.
We have information that the field started weakening about 450 years ago, maybe a little bit earlier than that. But it wasn't weakening very much. And the poles themselves, the magnetic poles, they weren't doing anything abnormal. They were just kind of doing their normal traipse around. They're not like the geographic poles, which stay put. These we expect to move around a few kilometers every decade or so.
Mm-hmm.
Now, from 1850 to the year 2000, the weakening accelerated, and we lost 10% of Earth's magnetic field in about 150 years. And during that time, the magnetic pole movement accelerated from a few kilometers per decade to a few kilometers per year.
So these are correlated, correct? The movement of the poles. Okay, and the shield.
Definitely. And if the logic alone isn't enough there, the group that is in charge of monitoring the magnetic field on Earth right now is the European Space Agency SWARM program, and they've confirmed that the magnetic field is weakening because the poles are getting ready to reverse. Now, that was 1850 to 2000. We go from slight field loss to losing a 10% chunk right there, and the field movement, the pole movement, really begins to speed up. Then we have just the next decade, 2000 to 2010. And during this time, we lost an additional 5% of Earth's magnetic field, and the pole movement could be going upwards of 60 or 70 kilometers per year. Wow. So we're talking about exponential increases in both the movement and the loss of the field. It took us 150 years to lose about 10%. But we lost 5% in just the next decade, meaning that if you project out one more decade, it would take only 20 years to lose what had taken us 150 years to lose the next time. And that is if we don't see any further acceleration. What if the next 5 is lost in just 5 years? After that, what if you lose 5% a year, and so on and so forth?
So what does this really mean for us, and what things do we need to prepare for? What do we need to look for, and why should we be concerned that our magnetic field, our shield is failing, is weakening? I mean, what's that really translate into for each of us? What should we be concerned about?
Well, a lot of that depends on how willing you are to look outside the box.
Okay.
If you start Googling things like pole shift and magnetic reversal, I'm sure it would not take too much effort to find people claiming that there are some really fantastical things that are going to happen.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Can't say any of those won't happen, but I don't have any way to say whether or not they will. However, we can already begin to notice a lot of these changes in the ground, in the atmosphere, in our technology, and I think a little bit in the people. You know,
Okay.
when the sun begins to act like this, we start to see unrest and chances for large-scale revolution. In
Interesting.
fact, you know, you look back through history at these times, and that's when you see a lot of these things taking place. And if you do a little survey of the status of people mentally and how they are in terms of whether or not they're happy with the way the world is going, there's a lot to be concerned about from a social, political, economic aspect. And so you can look through that and you say, all right, well, that's interesting, but I need a little bit more. I need a little bit more, something more tangible, because you can always, every 10 years or so, you could look at the economy or countries going to war or something and say, okay, well, fine. But let's look at what's happening with the earthquakes and what's happening with the weather.
Absolutely. I was headed that direction. Absolutely.
Starting with the earthquake, we have seen just in the last 6 years, 3 of the largest 4 earthquakes in the last 40 years.
Okay.
The number of magnitude 8 earthquakes should be about 1 every 12 months, about 1 a year. We are now averaging about 2 a year.
Okay.
We are seeing the earthquakes ramp up, and one of the likely reasons for that is because this energy from space now has a more direct line to triggering this pressure that has been building up. It's not like this solar energy just causes an earthquake out of nowhere. There's, everything about geology and seismology in the Earth is a lot of that's still valid. We still have pressure building up over time here and there, but it's about what can trigger that. And we're seeing that as we know, there's this correlation that scientists are beginning to discover. We know there's only one thing that stands in the way of the sun's energy affecting Earth, and we know it's weakening, and we see the earthquakes ramping up like crazy.
So as we look at the sun and kind of going into a minimum period, what is it that's triggering? Because you have coronal holes, you've got the filaments, all kinds of different aspects of things that happen on the sun. What are those things that actually affect? Because I know you're working on this disaster prediction app. What are you using in order to come up with your models?
Well, essentially, using things you mentioned like coronal holes, essentially what we're able to do is we're able to monitor where the magnetic fields on the sun that stream out through the entire solar system are actually located. There are some magnetic fields on the sun that come out and then they loop right back down, and they're pretty much contained within the solar atmosphere.
Mm-hmm.
But there are others that stream out all the way past Pluto. They sweep past the planets. They actually will magnetically connect to the magnetic fields of the individual planets. NASA calls these flux tubes or magnetic portals, which makes me think of science fiction,
Yeah,
but it's absolutely
absolutely
not. These are very real things. And so, a lot of folks have focused on things like sunspots in the past or the solar flares.
Mm-hmm.
What is turning out to actually offer the most rewards is looking at the magnetic fields of the sun that are actually able to reach out and touch the planet. And that's one of the things we're going to be looking at for this disaster prediction app.
So I know previously it seems like gravity has kind of been the dominating factor of how the solar system works, correct? But it's more electrical and more magnetic. Am I?
Definitely.
Okay.
Definitely. We noticed that. To put it very simply, and I'm not even really doing it any injustice. It really is this simple. We can monitor the strength of these magnetic fields in addition to where they're pointing. The coronal holes often tell us where they're pointing, but we also have special devices. Stanford uses them, and we can monitor how powerful these magnetic fields on the sun are. And so we can see when they're strong, we can see when they're weak, we can see when they reverse polarity, positive to negative, negative to positive. And it turns out that about 80 to 85% of the magnitude 8 earthquakes, the biggest ones on the planet, are going to happen within 10 days of either a peak in magnetic force or the reversal, positive to negative, negative to positive. And these events only happen about once a year in terms of the peak of magnetic strength. The reversals only come about every 11 years or so. So these things are separated by hundreds of days to years, and yet all of the big earthquakes seem to be within just a handful of days of the times when a logical person might say, hey, these are the two times in magnetic terms when things are the most important, when they're the strongest, and then when they're switching sides, positive to negative, negative to positive. It's the moment where a push becomes a pull, where a pull becomes a push, where the force actually changes direction.
Now, I know you've sent out a challenge to NASA on this to kind of step up and help out with the science.
Well, it's actually to the United States Geological Survey,
right. Okay.
Particularly to one of their big guys, a guy named Jeffrey Love, who has spent a good part of the last decade putting out papers talking about how the sun doesn't cause earthquakes, doesn't cause climate change. And, of course, the data cited for the earthquakes would be those sunspots, the solar flares, those other things that people have been looking at unsuccessfully throughout the past. And we're basically challenging him to see what literally middle school and high school classrooms all over the country are seeing. I actually was not aware of how many teachers watched us until they started sending in stuff from their classes, questions from their classes, earthquake watches from their classes. I mean, we've got 13-year-old kids making earthquake predictions and doing fairly well. There's actually a girl in Idaho who predicted something like 70% of the 7 magnitude earthquake times last year. We can't quite get the location down yet, but in terms of figuring out when the Earth is going to rock and roll, that's getting easier and easier. And as we, tying this back into our conversation, as Earth's magnetic field weakens, these time periods are going to be more and more likely to trigger these large events, and so we'll probably see an increase in the number of these major earthquakes, but potentially also in the severity as well. Hopefully we don't see too many magnitude 9s, but it wouldn't exactly shock me now.
When was the last time we actually saw a magnitude 9 on the planet?
That was Japan, 2011, the Fukushima disaster.
So we had a caller just called in. Their question was, from a physics perspective, how do coronal masses cause electrical fields?
How do coronal masses
coronal mass ejections, I guess?
Yeah, CMEs. How does a CME cause the electrical field?
Well, the CME doesn't really cause the electric field. The CME is a ripple in the electric field. The solar wind, while it is, made up of tiny individual particles, the entire mass of the solar wind, as it, starting from where it's coming out of the sun to however many millions of miles away the furthest away solar wind particles blasting past Pluto are.
So a CME So a CME is actually particles, not like a magnetic field, or does it generate a magnetic field? Is that kind of what the question is?
It sort of generates its own magnetic field and can affect others, but essentially it's particles.
Okay.
And so, what we have here, basically, if you can consider that, from where we're standing on the ground up to the edge of space is, the atmosphere. That is a field of air particles. From the sun all the way out past Pluto, where all the solar wind is, that is actually an electric field of particles, because unlike our atmosphere, these are the charged particles of the solar wind. Now, a coronal mass ejection is an ultra dense and usually very fast version of this, often caused by something like a solar flare. And the electric field of the solar wind has its own properties, and certainly if you change the density, the movement, the activity, it's going to change the ambient magnetic fields and everything else around it. But simply by the fact that it is charged particles itself, it will create the magnetic fields and electric currents and electric fields, making up the electric fields and things like that.
And I guess this ties into your star water theory. How that works is these, if I can, I am doing my best to follow you and to try and And I try and keep up with with the information as much as I can, but it's still a lot of information really packed in there. I understand this, listeners, that it can be difficult to follow if you haven't quite educated yourself yet. So,
well, before you finish that,
go ahead.
We did post a video on our Facebook feed. So if you go to K-Talk or PrepperCon on Facebook, you'll see one of the I like to kind of call it the intro video. Help you understand what's going on with the magnetic field, what's going on with the CME, what those mean. So to get a better understanding of what Ben's talking about, please go and watch that video, and then go to his websites. That's going to help.
I'd have to recommend that website, theearthchanges.org, as you were alluding to earlier. The stuff about the earthquakes isn't as much on that page, but the stuff that is, I would say, even more blatantly obvious is what you're going to be able to find on that page, and that is the effects that this stuff is having on the weather and our technology. Now, I'm not sure when our next break is. This is kind of...
we got about a minute.
Well, about 30
all
seconds.
Right, well, when we come back from that break, let's talk a little bit about some of the evidence that, this isn't speculation, this isn't open for interpretation, it's just this is what happened, and then this is what happened next.
Perfect.
In terms of the technology and the weather, because that's where it's really getting scary and really getting obvious that
and like you're saying,
a bit of trouble.
Like you're saying, it is actually quite simple. You need to learn the basics, but it's very quite simple. Like you say, these elementary school kids are predicting earthquakes. So It makes a lot of sense once you learn some of the basics and watch some of his videos. It's very fascinating.
Absolutely. And as a reminder for everyone that's listening in, this wouldn't be possible if we didn't have such amazing people like Ben who wanted to share, who wanted to educate people. And so we're very thankful and gracious for your time, and we appreciate you being on this week. And we're able to do this all because of our good friends over at Survival Medical. They've sponsored the show. They believe in what we're doing, trying to help people be better prepared, understand, but most importantly, educated on what's really going on. So thanks for tuning in. You're listening to PrepperCon Radio. It's AM 630, brought to you by survival-medical.com. We'll be right back after this break. We're going to talk more about what's going on with our magnetic field, the disturbances we see, what we don't see, and how we can track it.
Whether you're injured...
Wow, I feel like we're an easy listening station all of a sudden. Guys, you're listening to PrepperCon Radio, and as always, the music's kind of goofball-y. Thanks to DJ Doodleberry over
DJ
here.
Jazzy Shane. At least we
Jazzy
didn't.
Shane, DJ Smooth Listening Weirdo
Smooth
Shane.
I was going to go with a disco theme for this show because Scott was going to be on vacation, and we were going to do a disco-themed PrepperCon Radio, but I actually had Kristen scrub that because I found out Scott was going to be here, and I didn't want him to go on a murderous rampage. So
I'm like the giant... Shane's like the little kid that fell into the gorilla enclosure, and I'm the gorilla. So rather than shoot me, they just changed the music, and I'm okay.
If you guys had gone with disco, you could have invented a dance called the life straw. By the way, I actually have one of those. I think it's incredible. I could use another one, life straw. You guys can feel free to send me one for that little
Absolutely.
It's great.
We'll get one up to you.
Everyone should have one.
Absolutely.
They're very cool. Mine was actually given to me, and I had never heard of it before. Did my homework thereafter, and boy, that's a lot easier than carrying around water or worrying if you've got the right amount of purification tablets or carrying around your carbon. I know just about every way to purify water in a shiz hits the fan situation, if you will pardon my English.
We use that term all the time on here, so.
Yeah, fair enough.
And that's what I'd like to talk about a little bit more, is that how do we prepare? What do you recommend that we do before the hour's over here, which you've got about, about 12, 13 minutes
Yeah, we got about 14 minutes, but in addition to that, you're about to lead into, how are we seeing these things play out, and what can we look for?
Right. Well, I think I can do both in 14 minutes.
All right.
Okay, go for it. Ready, go.
To start, we are seeing the weather being incredibly disturbed by every single solar event. If you perhaps would notice a time when the Earth is really quiet, I can assure you that's a time when the sun's been really quiet. Or if there is a time when there was a tropical system that was on alert, and it turned out to peter out, didn't do much. Turns out the sun didn't do anything during that time. One of the best places to start is last year in June. We had, all of a sudden, the sun sort of woke up from its little nap and got really angry for about 3 days. A coronal whole solar wind stream hit us, a couple of solar flares erupted, and a plasma filament ripped away from the sun and hit us as well. It was a bunch of different things. And we saw 6 cyclones pop up at the same time in the Pacific Ocean. It had only been recorded one other time before this.
And like you mentioned before, they weren't very big flares, correct? They weren't.
No, it wasn't. It wasn't very much. It's the kind of thing where, we saw major activity before Katrina. We saw major activity before some of the other damaging ones. But this is the kind of thing that Earth normally handles without any kind of issue.
Mm-hmm.
Except this time, we just saw, literally within days, all of these tropical storms pop up, and 2 other lows that came within literally just a few millibars of pressure of hitting that mark as well. We could have had 7 or even 8 for the first time ever at once.
And you call these Earth spots, correct?
Yes, they're Earth spots because they behave exactly like sunspots. There are 8 different points I can look at, both in terms of physical and energetic characteristics of a sunspot, and you see them in earthly hurricanes and cyclones and typhoons as well.
Wow, that's interesting.
So that was in June, and we had a couple of more solar storms, about 5 more solar storms throughout the year, as 2015 closed out. And during each of them, we had record-setting weather. That has continued into 2016 as well. The kind of thing where we have seen, in terms of either the earliest, recorded formation of this many storm events, or the strongest storm on record, which happened in the middle of a solar storm, Hurricane Patricia, which hit Mexico last year. It intensified while a solar storm was taking place. Everything, I think the most recent one was Cyclone Santala, which became the strongest cyclone in the history of the Indian Ocean. And that one, again, occurred during a solar storm. You want to talk about something that didn't exactly break records in terms of intensity, but we just had Tropical Storm Colin about a week and a half ago pop up in the Gulf of Mexico and run up through Florida. Now, that didn't cause too much damage, but it was the earliest C-named storm, C for Colin, the earliest, time we've had 3 named storms in 1 year. And all 3 of these storms have happened during the solar event. It's getting to the point where any time the sun hits us with anything, that's when the Earth is going to throw up a tropical storm.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we have seen about a 5 to 10x increase over the last decade in what I would call sun-induced storms. We have seen a far greater increase in the amount of technological disturbances. So we get about 1 major technological disturbance every decade, and it usually takes the most powerful solar activity of that decade. So in 2012, we lost the SkyTerra orbiting station. Back in 2003, we had a transformer and power grid blow in Sweden. In the early 90s, we lost a couple of space weather satellites. In 1989, a power grid blew in Quebec. Essentially, these things don't happen very often. However, in that same June event from last year, they had to take down every plane over New Zealand because they couldn't see anything on radar. The next time we had a solar storm, that was when over 200 flights got delayed and canceled in the East Coast of the United States when there was that system malfunction with the radar, again, during the peak of a solar storm. Happened again in November, a solar storm, and they dropped all the flights over Sweden. The air traffic control said, and I quote, "We just see static." They couldn't see any airplanes. The BART transportation train system in San Francisco, many people know it, had a number of electrical surges and glitches that really caused a lot of issues earlier this year, happened during the peak of the solar storm. There are a couple websites we go to that track airline incidents, electrical fires, transformer fires, things like this, even things like communication blackouts, power blackouts, internet trouble. The PlayStation Network is amazing to track. They go down every time there's a solar storm. I got to recommend you track the PlayStation Network. But essentially, we are seeing every time we get these solar events, there is a 5 to 10x increase in electrical fires, in power outages. And, it's tough to look at any one event because electrical fires happen. Transformers blow. Storms come through and take out power. Sometimes people running too much air conditioning can knock out the power in a given area. But over the long time periods and over the entire world, when you see such an increase only during the times of the storms, and you can go back into the past, this stuff did not used to happen. Definitely not. But these are the kind of things we would expect from a major solar event, because it's not just impacting Earth's magnetic field and affecting the atmosphere. These charged particles and electric currents come all the way down and shoot through the ground. This is one of the ways we think they may help trigger earthquakes, but it is definitely the way in which power grids and other things like electrical fires and other things like that can occur.
So you're working on your disaster prediction app. Is that going to be able to help us prepare for these type of events? Are we going to be able to see those a little bit in advance?
Absolutely. A lot of the focus for the disaster prediction app has been on the earthquake element. And I suppose I can't really fault people for that. However, within the almost 300,000 people that pay attention to this stuff, they have been begging for a way to get notifications directly on their phone or their iPad without having to go to one of our websites to see what's happening, without having to go and watch that morning update. They just want to know that, hey, if something big is going to happen, and let's say it happens 10 minutes after my morning update, and it's 24 hours before I'm set to do another one on YouTube, they want to feel assured that something is going to come to their phone and let them know that that's going to happen. Now, thus far, we've just been using Twitter, which is really not that good of a stand-in. And there's no automated app, monitoring of space weather, things like that. But the app will be able to, through its automatic programs that monitor these things, and through my action of manually sending notifications when necessary, this will absolutely be able to give anywhere from a few hours to a couple of days more notice than the rest of the world gets.
Now, let's dig into this a little bit. Excuse me. You guys raised almost $120,000 on Kickstarter for this app. I mean, your goal was what, like 30 or 40?
Right.
And you just blew that away. This is how important this really is, that there's nothing else out there like this, even remotely. And
no, not really. And, the fact that we were able to get so much really enabled us to automate a lot of these things. So this will be working when I sleep kind of stuff, which, is sort of the one hitch in my plan thus far. I haven't figured out how to stay awake all hours of the day yet. I'm working on it.
So what time do you go to bed? Because I know you're up at like 3 a.m., 4 a.m. doing your news, putting your news together.
My little daughter is a godsend because she goes down at about 7:30 every night, and I've started relieving my wife of night duty, and I just basically go to sleep with her. And
that's awesome.
I wake up because I'm in Albuquerque, New Mexico now. We're waking up at about 1 a.m. local time because we got to stay on East Coast time. A lot of our viewers are still out there, and they need to see everything before they go to work in the morning. But real quick with the last couple of minutes here, some of the things that I have to recommend in terms of prepping. Sort of as a baseline, there's a number of reasons to prep. So, for example, I know a guy who did all the normal stuff you think of. He has canned food. He has other kinds of, freeze-dried food. He's got ways to get water. He's got some tools. He's got some organic heirloom seeds, not those Franken seeds from Monsanto. But he also stockpiled cash, silver and gold, but also cash. Well, you know what his shiz hits the fan situation was? He fell off a ladder while painting. Broke his back, couldn't work, would have lost the house, would have lost their cars, would have gone into major debt. That was his shiz hits the fan scenario. And so for what he needed, he was prepared. Now, for what I'm talking about, I am not talking about a situation where you need to rely on your neighbor or hope you can get to a phone in time. I'm talking about a situation where the global grids go down, and not just somebody has to go reset a breaker. I'm talking the transformers all blow.
So
the
that's
wires
really
all
worst case scenario.
complete worst case scenario. And so you need to be looking beyond just your food, your water. I recommend everybody, even if guns make you feel uncomfortable, I guarantee you something happening to your family probably makes you feel even more uncomfortable. I absolutely exercise my Second Amendment, and I don't think it's a bad idea for anyone else to do so. Although if you're good with a knife or you have a crossbow, I'm not sure I'd want to cross you in that situation either. But, think about things that go beyond just the heirloom seeds, which a lot of people know. You're not going to have electricity or any kind of electric tools to plant these. Do you have pre-industrial farming tools? How much of an outdoorsman are you? I am actually not that much of an outdoorsman, despite how much I recognize the necessity to be one might be there in the future.
Well, and we really appreciate your service in preparing this for us and keeping us aware of these things. And we realize that it's a sacrifice for you that, like you say, you're not able to necessarily learn some of those skills that some of us are practicing, like bushcraft and so forth. But we really appreciate your sacrifice that way and helping us to be aware of what we need to be prepared of. And in the last few minutes here, let's talk real quick about your sites, what you do, because I know you have your free side. You also have your subscription side as well.
Yeah.
Before you jump into that, we had a caller, and I wanted to address this. We had a caller that wanted to find out about your educational background, what makes you an expert in this. And then I'll say a quick note about that too. But just real quickly, what's your background that got you into this, and what's your educational level?
Well, my primary education for this stuff, my research education was in law school. I was very, very good at research. I got an internship with the Supreme Court of Ohio and then the largest firm in Columbus before I realized I didn't want to be a lawyer, but what all lawyers are, if they're not lawyers, is research experts, and they absolutely are that. And when you work for people who are investing $50, $100 million, boy, do you learn the right ways to analyze things. Kind of the whole form your hypothesis after you've got data kind of thing.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
Okay, we're down to about the last 30 seconds or so, so please tell us about your site, your subscriptions, and so forth.
Well, right on. I got to recommend that, before anyone goes and spends any money on a site subscription, which you'll easily find out how to do if you watch the morning news, I recommend you watch the free morning news, because they're going to tell you everything you need to know and tell you whether or not it's worth spending $4 to get about 250 hours worth of content.
$4. Woo. All right. Well, Ben, thank you so much for joining us, and we will have you back again soon. This hour is sponsored by Survival Medical, the only first aid kit designed for long-term storage. Find out more at survival-medical.com, and join us next week. Thank you very much.
Since we were children, we've been told to reach for the